So you want to make a documentary. And my first question for you is what's your what's your idea? Do you have a good idea? I've certainly had ideas I thought were good ideas that maybe didn't end up being that great of ideas. So how can you evaluate if this idea is worth putting all the time and effort and potentially money into making a documentary about it? And so I want to give you some sort of rubric here, or some tests you can put your idea through to see if this is an idea that could make for a solid documentary. And so the first one on my list here is passion. Are you are you actually passionate about the subject matter? Because if you're really going to be serious about it, you're going to have to live this subject night and day for quite a while, depending on how long the documentary is and what kind of investment is required to tell this story. So is this something that you are so passionate about that you want to learn everything about and talk to people about for a long time and work with well beyond when most people would be bored of something and give up? So if you are super passionate about this idea, that is a great first step. And that's I'd probably put that in as one of my deal breaker concepts. Depends, if someone's paying you to make this documentary, then maybe that will be motivation. But if you're not passionate about it, it better be a short film, is all I can say. Or there better be some other outside forces encouraging you to complete the project. The second concept here is access, and this is a deal breaker too. Do you have access to what you would need, the people, locations, maybe archival footage, pictures, those kind of materials, in order to tell the story well? If you do, or if you have exceptional access that a lot of other people don't have, that is a major plus for this category. If you don't have access, that's pretty much a deal breaker. So if you happen to know someone personally who is really close to a significant subject in current events or something of that nature, or whatever your subject may be, if you have great access, that's a major plus, because you might be able to tell a story that other people can't, or tell it in a way that other people can't. So what kind of access do you have? If you got no access, I think you got no story, depending on the subject matter. And then feasibility, which I would consider another deal breaker. Is it practical to take on the project that you're interested in doing? For example, are you talking about doing like a 15-part documentary on the Civil War, like Ken Burns or something of that nature? Are you really able to take on a project of that length with all the time and money and commitment required for that? And so, it's practically speaking, do you have what it takes to complete this? Either the amount of time required, the cost that may be required, and traveling if that's required for your project. Maybe it's going to require that you buy archival footage, which can be very, very expensive. I mean, they charge by like the second, for a lot of the stuff if it's really popular stuff. So is this something you really are capable of taking on? And can you do it in a reasonable timeline as well? If there's something timely about your project, are you actually able to get it done while it's still relevant, or will it just be old news, or someone will have done it bigger and better before you can finish it? So that's another deal breaker one. Drama is one that you can make a film that has no drama, a documentary, and that's fine. It'd be good if it's on the shorter side. You can do a documentary about just about anything on the shorter side, like maybe under 20 minutes at most. But if you want to do something longer than that, is there some kind of conflict, or can you fabricate that conflict somehow? For example, there's a great documentary called How's Your News, which is a documentary about a group of mentally challenged adults who go on a road trip with basically the camp counselor from a camp that they all would go to. And they go on a road trip in this RV across America doing like kind of their own version of news reports. So, clearly the filmmakers wanted to do a documentary about these people, but just doing a documentary about them, like, where's the drama? Filming them at camp or something, there's not necessarily a lot of conflict. It's not them versus anyone else. So how do they inject that conflict into their story? They put them on the road. And that's a solution for a lot of things. any story you're like, there's not a lot of conflict inherent in this, not a lot of drama, put it on the road. That's what I did with my DeLorean documentary. I could have just made a documentary about me buying a DeLorean and driving around, but where's the conflict there? So I knew I was going to have to drive the DeLorean from Michigan to Fairbanks, and that's inherent conflict because it's you versus travel, basically. Travel is conflict. Pretty much. So when I mean, can you like manufacture some conflict, it's totally okay to do that ethically, if you do it in a smart and responsible way. And it happens all the time. I mean, reality TV shows tend to do it more unethically. They'll make up conflicts between characters just so that they're screaming on screen. But other ones, like, look at Survivor or the other sort of competition reality TV shows like that. They have all these contests. They don't have to. They could just show a bunch of people hanging around on an island, but they create the contest to create conflict and drama and so forth. So you can totally inject conflict intentionally into your idea, and that's fine. And audiences will definitely appreciate it. I mean, I'd much rather watch this group of adults travel in an RV across America than just watch them hanging out at camp, right? So it's totally acceptable, totally ethical when done, appropriately. So that's one way that you can take an idea that, on its own maybe isn't that strong and actually make it stronger using your understanding of storytelling and what makes for a good story. So that's one of the elements where talented storytelling abilities really come into play in terms of bringing your idea to life in a more vibrant way. And then also, are there any compelling questions? I mean, a lot of times conflict drama comes from questions. Films will start off with, does James Bond, is he able to save the world? I mean, every 007 movie, that's basically one of the questions they create. And every time we're like, I don't know, does he? So are there some compelling questions that relate to your subject matter, to your idea, that you could present at the beginning of the film and then answer, progressively through the film with the most compelling and riveting questions being answered near the end, near the climax? So what are some questions you can create? So, for example, with the DeLorean documentary, some of the questions at the beginning of that film are, does the DeLorean make it the 3,600 miles through the middle of nowhere and whatnot to Alaska? Who do we meet along the way? What happens along the way? These are all kind of questions that we create in the beginning of the film in the audience's mind. And they're not aware this is happening, but it's what keeps them interested because they're sticking around to see what the answers to those questions are. So what kind of questions can you create based on your documentary idea? And then plot. Does this documentary idea have a nice beginning, middle, and end? If it does, that's going to make it a lot easier to sell it to audiences, and a lot more likely it's going to be interesting and successful. If it and in that story, does the most interesting part come near the end? The climax come near the end? If those aren't true, this isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but it just means you're going to be up. You're going to have a bigger battle to make this film interesting and potentially successful and reach a wider audience. Because once you get away from like chronological order, and I'll talk about that in a second, where things start at the beginning and move their way through the end, and things peak near the end of the film, audiences are sort of like, I don't know about this. You better have very, very interesting or funny or quirky content. I've seen films, successful feature-length films, 90 minutes plus, that have succeeded without following a chronological order, but they're rare. And the one I can think of is related to just an extremely fascinating character. And of course, the name of it I'm blanking on at the moment, but when it comes back to me, I'll let you know. But if you got an incredibly interesting character, I'll watch them for 90 minutes, even if it's not clear what the order, why the footage is in this order, because it's that one question of like, what does he say next? What happens next? The cruise. I knew it was going to come to me about the New York City tour guide. Not a real chronological flow there, not necessarily like a climax near the end, just an incredibly eccentric guy who's fun to watch for 90 minutes. Those are the exception, though. So if you got an idea, or that's the nice thing about a road trip based film too. I know I like tell everyone their film should be a road trip, but as I've said before in these videos, no film ever failed that took place on a train. It just so easily lends itself to the chronological order, and then you just hope that there's some interesting climax near the end. And maybe that can be fabricated too. Maybe near the end of the trip, you plan some sort of event or something. You don't present it as spontaneous, but for example, in How's Your News, they plan at the end of the visit for one of the guys to meet his TV hero, who is this guy who plays a doctor in some soap opera. And so there's nothing unethical about that. It's not like they invented a problem. I mean, their RV does, spoiler, break down at some point. I assume that wasn't fabricated. But, they plan at the end of this trip, he'd get to meet him. There's nothing unethical about that. And they're not like they're presenting it like he just bumped into him on the road or anything. So that's plot, not a deal breaker if you don't have a real clear beginning, middle, and end and whatnot, but it's definitely a selling point if your film follows that rule. And then structure. So what kind of structure would you have for this? How are you going to organize the content of the film? And in order of my favorites, chronological, number one, just as it happened through time, because audiences can follow that easily. They get it. They understand why things are going in that order. So it doesn't require a lot of processing on their part. That's my favorite. If your documentary idea fits the chronological structure, that's the best, in my opinion. The second favorite would be problem solution. So you organize material where the beginning of the documentary is about a problem that we have, plastics in the ocean, pollution, whatever. There's plenty of that like that. And then it sort of wraps up with the potential solutions to this. That one works too. Not my favorite, but definitely works. And sometimes you can combine. For example, I've made films where there's chronological order in sort of one plot, but then we get topical put over that, kind of spacing out the chronological order. So I made a documentary called Finding Their Own Dance about the Alutiiq native people from the Kodiak region of Alaska. And so I knew that chronological was really the way to go with this. If I just went topical, if I just talked about all the different elements of how they're trying to bring art back in, make it a part of their culture again, it'd be kind of unclear, like, why are we, where is this thing going? So I took one group, an Alaska native group of dancers who happened to be just a real fun, likable group. They had a couple little kids, which if you got babies, animals, those are a couple things that are also a great selling point for a documentary. So whenever I can, I include babies or little kids and animals in my films because audiences love those. So basically, under this and the sort of underlying structure of the whole documentary was about following this dance group as they practiced and performed their very first native dance at a big gathering, honoring someone from their group. And then over that, I'd drop in like the history of how their traditional art was ripped from them by invading Russians and Americans, and some of the other elements of like how do you bring back a culture, artistic culture like that, in a way that reflects the past but it's also relevant, and so mixing those in. So doing kind of a combination of both, keeping in the back of my mind chronological. People want to have a clear sense of where this film is going. Okay, cause and effect. It's kind of similar to problem solution. So here's something that's happening, and here's the effect. That's, of course, this one doesn't have really the solution part about it, but there's certainly some topics where that could relate. It's okay. It's one notch down from my good old favorite chronological. Probably put it at roughly the same position, desirability, as problem solution. Then you get spatial, which is organizing your subject based on where it's located. So maybe you're making a documentary about a city and you want to talk about this part of the city and then this part. And so that's what's, telling the audience what's coming next, why we're talking about these things now. Because they can see like, oh, okay, we're going to do a documentary at the city. First, we're going to start here, then I'm going to move here. Sort of like Rick Steves when he does his travel videos. He's like, starts them off with, we're going to start in this part of Italy and then move to this part and this part. And the audience is like, okay, it's a bit chronological, but also spatial. And then topical, which is the worst. When it's all by itself. When it's mixed in with other stuff, that's cool. But if your film is just topical, that's a little bit rough, because with topical, it can be hard for an audience to understand, like, why did you order it in this way? What's the rationale behind that? That's what the audience wants to know, like, all the time. What is your reason for showing me this, telling me this, and doing it in this order? And so the problem with topical is, for an audience, it might just seem kind of like random why you organize things in that order. So that's my least favorite. There are ways you can work, and there's certainly ways you can combine them, which is great too. But if it's just topical, I'm like, right off the bat, I'm like, seems kind of boring, potentially. So be careful about that. Another thing to think about, not a deal breaker though, is your audience. So is this something that appeals to a very broad demographic, so you're more likely to find a larger audience that way, if that's a priority for you? Or is it more of a niche audience? Maybe you're making a documentary that appeals mainly to a certain group, certain hobbyists, or people with political or environmental or other sort of activist type interests. So yeah, think about it. Be honest, is this really interesting to a general public or not? If your goal is to, get some recognition from this, build a reputation for yourself, get into film festivals, then generally you're going to want to have something that appeals to a more general audience. At least, adults, maybe 25 to 70 or something like that, But it's not a deal breaker. It's up to you. Originality is another thing to think about. Are you the first one who's ever made a film on this? That's a major, major plus. Or has it been done a billion times and yours is just going to get lost in the clutter? So again, it's definitely not a deal breaker. You could make the same documentary that everyone else has made. Maybe you're going to make it in a different way. Maybe it hasn't been told in a while. So it will impact your success, but just because it's a topic that's been told a number of times doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't call for another film on that subject. It's just not a great thing. But maybe there's just a lot of demand about it. You want to make another documentary about extreme skiing, or another documentary about a buddy road trip. I mean, my road trip documentary is just another road trip documentary, but with a twist. It's a DeLorean this time, and so yeah. But it's by no means the first buddy road trip movie. So not a lot original about that, but what is original is the vehicle that we're taking. And then second to last here, humor. If it's just funny the whole time, sort of like The Cruise, is sometimes it's parts of it are funny and parts of it are just interesting. It doesn't really matter about the rest. I mean, obviously people watch 90 minutes of stand-up, and it's not like that follows any of these. That I guess would be topical. My least favorite structural manner of organizing your subject, but definitely can still work. So if it's really funny, then you can probably get away with not having a number of these other elements. And then timeliness. So sometimes you can make a pretty lousy documentary, but if you make it at just the right time where everybody wants to see or learn more about this topic at that point, then it could be successful. For example, I don't remember where I saw it, but somewhere I came upon a documentary, I think it might have been on the library's video streaming service, about Susan Boyle. And there weren't a lot of documentaries out that I was aware of about her. She's the woman who got her huge break as like the sleeper hit on Britain's Got Talent, where this woman who, frankly, looked a little bit like frumpy came out and sang like an angel, and the whole world fell in love, and she actually single-handedly saved the sales of CDs for a while because people wanted to buy her music. This is back when CDs were just about dead. She propped them up for a little bit longer. So I found some documentary about her, and I thought, oh, this is amazing. I haven't seen a lot of other stuff out about her. So I started watching it, and it was clearly it it looked like some seventh graders research project or something. It was clear they had zero, and I mean zero, access to Susan Boyle or anyone related to the story. They were just trying to whip up a documentary based on what could be found online. And so, it made it to the point where I saw it was available and watched a little bit of it before I quickly turned it off in horror at what I was seeing. This basically should have just been a YouTube video. But it was extremely timely. So if you've got something, sometimes you can predict that. Maybe you can kind of see which way the wind is blowing and do something on that, on a subject that relates to that. Or maybe you just get lucky. You happen to make a documentary about something, and then all of a sudden it's huge in the news for some reason. So timeliness is something that can trump a lot of these other elements, because if people are just desperate to see and learn more about the topic that your documentary is on, then they'll forgive a number of these other problems. So the final thing I want to say, is that don't put all your eggs in one basket until you've done some research. Explore a number of different ideas and see which ones look like they have the most potential, and then just pull the plug on the ones that don't. But if you're all in on something, this is 100% it, and then you get into it after a while and you're like, oh, I didn't fully understand this subject, or it wasn't what I thought it was going to be, then you're kind of out of luck. And some people, like me, will just continue to trudge on to this subject well beyond when when it's obvious that there isn't really much of a story here, just out of a sense of guilt or duty or something of that nature. So I would discourage that. That was one of the main lessons I learned when Ira Glass from This American Life came to Fairbanks, and I got to see him speak and meet with him. And it was just clear to me, these big podcast radio shows like his don't just say that looks like a great story, let's invest everything in that. No, they look into it, they get more information, and they're doing that for a variety of stories, coming back with that information and saying, okay, yeah, we're going to do this, but we're going to skip the rest of these. That was kind of I'm ashamed to say, sort of revolutionary to me when I heard that. I just felt well, you pick a subject and you just go for it. No, don't be afraid to throw the documentary production into reverse and say, you know what, this one I just don't feel like it's going anywhere. Even maybe after you've done some interviews, you've invested a bit into it, and go into that whatever project with that mindset, and making sure people understand that there's a chance this may not pan out. That's just the nature of the business. So yeah, don't be afraid to pull the plug if it's clear that this isn't going the way that you hoped it would. And then also keep other options open. Explore things, because you might be surprised. An idea that you thought maybe didn't have a lot going for it could turn out to have some gems hiding in there, and vice versa. So those are some ways I would evaluate your ideas. If your idea is really, if in an honest evaluation of your idea, you feel like it answers, a lot of these questions well, then you're potentially in very good shape. When I was thinking about the DeLorean documentary, I was like, well, we've got, me and my best buddy Chris. So he and I have good, you know, um, we have a great relationship. We both, pretty funny guys. We've known each other forever. I donated a kidney to his mom. I mean, that's the kind of connection that we have. We're both like, middle aged, and I think he at least is fun to watch on camera. I know this gets a little bit old, but put me in a DeLorean. I'm way more interesting. And you've got the road trip element, and you've got all the different things. And over the course of that documentary, I set up some things intentionally to happen, and then other things just happened by chance, because that's the nature of going on a giant road trip like this. Things are going to happen that you didn't expect, for better and worse. And so, just as I ran through all of these ideas, am I passionate about it? Yes, I'm absolutely passionate about the subject matter. I desperately want this DeLorean to get to Fairbanks, and I want to film it. Do I have access? Absolutely. If you're the character in the documentary, that's pretty great access. The downside is, for someone like me, I can't. It's hard to film myself, so I had to throw the camera to Chris, who is not a professional videographer. So that's a little bit of a problem. Feasibility. Yes, I'm taking the car back to Alaska already. I have access to a bunch of gear already because I work in the journalism department, so costs and time and all that were fine. Drama, inherent conflict. We've got the road trip conflict. We've got the 35-year-old car make it up to Fairbanks? And if it has any trouble, nobody in, Yukon territory is likely to know much about working on a DeLorean. I could be wrong. So you've got that conflict, and I need to establish very clearly, and I hope establish very clearly in the beginning of the film, that this is my dream car. Like, if anything happens to this film, the film was my dream documentary too. If anything happens to this car, I will be devastated. Excuse me. So these are things that you need to set up in the beginning of your film as well. What's at stake? What's at stake is my dream of owning this car, which I've had for, probably decades at that point. If this car gets destroyed, it's impossible to conceive. So there's some also drama there. It's got a clear beginning, middle, and end. The end, of course, I set up that all my friends would be in Fairbanks to greet me, so that there would be that climax by default. I couldn't necessarily say that the most exciting part of the documentary would happen near the end, but I knew that the end was going to have a payoff, and that was going to be the climax of me rolling into my group of friends with a going door up, slapping their hands as they parted for me. I had it all in mind beforehand. Structure, it fits chronological, so that's easy. My favorite structure. Audience, fairly good, pretty general audience for this one. Originality, certainly it's not original that it's about being a buddy road trip movie, but it's the first one in a DeLorean that I'm aware of. Humor, we injected a lot of humor into it, just off the cuff, but we also had some plan too. Timeliness, not necessarily so relevant. That you had Back to the Future had its 30th anniversary a few years ago, but so it didn't really line up with that. So timeliness wasn't a necessarily great thing, other than people like me who grew up with Back to the Future and love that car are starting to get to the age where they might be able to afford it and be thinking about buying that classic car that they've dreamed of. And so that kind of timeliness of this is about the time when people of my demographic are maybe feeling a little nostalgic for the things they dreamed of in their youth. So because that documentary idea seemed to do well on those various tests is one of the reasons why I felt it was worth doing. I've had plenty of others where you're like, it's cool, but it doesn't pass some of these tests. so it's not likely to work so great. I mean, one of the documentaries I made that kind of failed was this model railroad documentary. I wanted to make a documentary about the Model Railroad Club in Fairbanks. Thought these must be a bunch of fun, eccentric guys and cool models and stuff, and it'd be, there's motion, so that's a good element too to consider. Like this, we're in the motion picture business. Does your documentary inherently have some movement to it? So I thought, yeah, there's great visuals for this. Well, I was passionate about it. I did have good access. It was feasible. There was some drama, but it was that kind of like club drama that I was not necessarily encouraged to talk about. So drama wasn't that strong. Plot was really tough. I didn't have a good sense of beginning, middle, end. Looking back on it, I can see how I could have, if I had thought more about it, I could have had a good plot by documenting the creation of this massive layout they were making. I could have done a beginning of them working on the layout, middle, and the end. It would have taken longer because it took them years to do that. But that would have been a natural way I could have injected a chronological structure into this larger subject. But I wasn't thinking it through that well. So the structure that I ended up with was kind of topical and, which is just kind of a little bit rough. Audience could actually be pretty big for that. There's a lot of model railroad fans. Originality, yeah, pretty good. There aren't too many model railroad documentaries I'm aware of like this, but maybe there are more now. There was some humor. Timeliness was not relevant. So the main area where that film kind of struggled for me was conflict and structure. Like where was the drama and how was I going to order this material? And that's kind of where I got stuck. I got pretty well through a rough edit, and then I just couldn't figure out where to go with it from there because I hadn't built a real strong launch pad for this project in the pre-production phase, and I didn't have as good of a sense of these elements here as you do now. And so yeah, I just alluded to it, but I also I want to make sure to point out that the visual side is very important too. What about your idea justifies it being on the screen? Why not a book? Why not a podcast? Why not something else? So if your film has a lot of inherent interesting motion in it, then that's a very good selling point as well. And if it doesn't, it's not a deal breaker, but there's definitely going to be something you're going to have to try and address somehow. How are we going to make people want to watch this? What kind of visuals are you going to show to keep it interesting? Because we are in the motion picture business. So what pictures are you going to show us that are in motion? Besides this, talking head. Well, admit, one of the most boring shots you can have, but I'm hoping that the content is worth watching me just sit here and talk. So there you go. There's some ways to test out your ideas. And remember, if your subject doesn't inherently have all of these elements, think about ways that you could possibly inject them. Doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't be a good documentary. It just means you might have to kind of play around with a little bit and insert some things on your own in an ethical way that's honest with the audience to make it more interesting. Because you got a story you want to tell. Audiences want to see a great film. So just work with them. Work with your idea to give them what they want.